Let's talk about the behavioural components. So you'll see that there are 11 pages, one for each of these behavioural components. And on each page you've got 3 curved graphs. Now, if you've watched the video on the grid, you'll know that we're talking about usual behaviour, underlying needs, stress behaviour. And that's the order of the graphs. There's one for each of those. The top graph is always usual behaviour, the middle graph is your underlying needs, the bottom graph is your stress behaviour. Now, these pages are pretty self-explanatory, but just to give you the framework, the reason we have these curved graphs is that each of these scales is effectively a bipolar scale. In other words, there's something that's true at the high end of the scale, which is the right-hand end of the scale. There's something that's equally true at the opposite end of the scale, the left-hand or low end of the scale. But what is true there will be the opposite of what's true at the right-hand end of the scale. Okay, so the reason that the graph is curved is that we have something is intensely true at the right-hand end of the scale, it's intensely true at the left-hand end of the scale, but if we're in the middle, then it'll be a balance, and so there'll be less intensity. So that's the reason for the curved graphs. Now, on each of those graphs, you'll see a little diamond marker or triangular marker that tells you where your score falls, and then some narrative at the bottom that explains what it's saying about you. Now, you'll see, most of you will see in most cases that your marker for need is the same as your marker for stress. Most people will have at least one score and maybe many more where that is not true. So you'll find that where your need is the opposite end of the scale from where your stress is. Those tend to be the most important scores. But what I'd say about that is it's best to talk to a Birkman consultant about that, because I'm not going to try and get into the meaning of that in this short video. So very quickly, let me go through these 11 behavioural components and tell you what they're really getting at. So we start with esteem. This is really how you deal in one-on-one situations, both in terms of how you'll behave, your usual behaviour, what you need from others, and of course how you'll react if your needs are not being met. So the left-hand end of the scale, the low end of the scale, is about being direct and matter-of-fact and to the point. So if there's something that needs to be communicated and you're at the left-hand end of the scale, then either you will be very direct or you will need directness from others. The right-hand end of the scale, the high end of the scale, is about being diplomatic, sensitive, and so on. So at that end of the scale, someone will either behave in a very diplomatic way or need others to be very diplomatic with them. So I hope that's clear. As I go through, I'm just going to give you what the two ends of the scale are about. So that was esteem. Next one is acceptance. Acceptance is actually a measure of sociability. If you're at the high end of the scale, the right-hand end, it's suggesting that you are either sociable or need a social context to work in. At the left-hand or low end of the scale, you tend to be more autonomous. You don't need people, you just need to be left alone to some extent. Structure is the next one. This is really a measure of process and particularly how much you believe there's one right way of doing things. If you're at the high end of the scale, the right-hand end of the scale, then you probably do believe there's one right way of doing things. That's how things should be done. If you're at the left-hand end of the scale, then it's more about being flexible. Yes, there's a right way of doing things, but we need to look at the situation and the context and adjust accordingly. Authority is the next one. This is actually a measure of verbal dominance, which sounds scary, but all that means is if you're at the high end or the right-hand end of the scale, you will tend to be or need verbal dominance. So in other words, if your usual score is at the high end of the scale, you will tend to give clear instructions, and if your need is at the high end of the scale, you need clarity about who's in charge. The low end of the scale tends to be a much more collegial, collectivist kind of approach to leadership, and if it's a need score that's at the low end of the scale, you'll tend to appreciate a more low-key approach to things. Advantage is the next one. Advantage is really a measure of, at the high end of the scale, how much you need advantage, how much you need feedback, how much you need to know how you're doing. At the left-hand end of the scale, it tends to be more about, I want to see everybody treated the same. I don't want to see people being specially rewarded for special effort because we're all in this together. Activity, the next one. So this is really about how you either burn or conserve energy, and also about how fast you like to make decisions. So at the high end of the scale, the right-hand end of the scale, we have people who are very energetic, who keep up a high work rate and who like to get decisions made quickly. At the low end of the scale, we've got people who are much more reflective and measured in their pace. Challenge is the next one. Now this is unusual. You will see, regardless of who you are, you will see that your marker is in the same spot on all three scales. The reason for that is that challenge is a bit unusual. You only get one challenge score. And it's kind of important. It's arguably the most important score in the Birkman report because it's telling us how you construct your sense of self. Now again, this could take a long time to explain. So what I'll say for now is that people at the high end of the challenge scale will tend to like taking a bit of a leap into the dark, pushing themselves out of their comfort zone, attempting things they've never done before. Whereas people at the low end of the scale will be more likely to want to move out of their comfort zone in a more incremental way. So if this is what I've succeeded at in the past, then this is what I could reasonably take on now. So it's not about whether you will take risks or not, but it's about the way you will take risks. Those of us at the high end of the scale will tend to, favor a leap into the dark. Those at the low end of the scale would see that as a bit silly, will want to take a more measured approach to risk and so on. That should take us down to empathy. Empathy is the next one. This is very simple. The low end of the scale, the left-hand end, is about objectivity. The right-hand end of the scale is about subjectivity. And this scale maps pretty neatly onto the horizontal axis of the grid. Remember I said left-hand side of the grid tends to be more objective, right-hand side more subjective. Next one is change. Change is not about organizational change. In fact, organizational change, we'd look at the structure score. But change is about, at the high end, it's about embracing variety or a need for variety. At the low end, it's about focus. People at the left-hand end of the scale tend to be more focused or to need to know what to expect a lot more than people at the high end of the scale. Freedom, the second to last one. High end of the scale is about independence and individuality. Low end of the scale is more about conformity and fitting in. And then finally, thought. At the high end of the scale, we've got people who like to process ambiguity and complexity in great detail. At the low end of the scale, we've got people who like to get into action as fast as possible, so who will tend to try and reduce complexity by saying, okay, this is complex, let's do A, B, C, and get on with the job. So there you are, a very quick run through those 11 behavioral components. Thanks for listening.